So I have 40 minutes here to preach a long-winded sermon and do communion and 2 worship songs. Good luck. All right, so when I mention certain names from culture or from history, a very particular characteristic or word might come to mind. If I say Kobe, again, we're talking about people, not beef. If I say Kobe, you think what? Basketball. I mean, you might think of what happened with his accident or whatever. If I say Sinatra, what do you think of? Music. You think of what? Okay. Nobody thinks of the mob, really? Okay. Denzel. What do you think of if I say Denzel? Washington. Acting, maybe a particular movie. One of his movies for a while there was playing on loop at our house. Remember the Titans because of Eli. If I say king, well, you might think of a number of things. You might think tennis. You might think civil rights. You might think books. If you're into like creepy Pet Cemetery type books. It could be referring to a number of different things. What do you think of when I say the name Solomon? Most people associate wisdom with Solomon, and for good reason. We read in the Bible that Solomon was granted a discerning heart by God. But there might be some other things that come to mind when you hear the name Solomon. Maybe you think of his judgment. Maybe you think of him building the temple. Maybe you think, Eli, there's a picture that if you could put up, it's like a fake selfie. When you hear the name Solomon, you might think of wives, like a lot of wives, 700 wives and 300 side chicks. Do we have the picture? No picture for it. Man, I'll have to find out what happened to it. I don't know if you've seen online lately, there's been this AI thing where they create like fake selfies taken from history. And so someone asked the AI generator to do a selfie for Solomon, and it had this picture of like this king with like 1,000 women behind him. Just like smiling away and things like that. So yes, Solomon, you might think, okay, 1,000 baby mamas type of thing for Solomon. Oh, to him personally, not for us to show. Oh, okay, no, that was for us. So there are a couple of things that we can talk about when we think of the person Solomon from the Bible. For the past few weeks, we've looked at to one person of the Bible to see how his or her characteristic, their life can teach us something about our own faith walk with God. And today with Solomon, we see someone who started out so well with God, but in his pursuit of the things of this world, he ended up wandering from God to the point where God even took away Solomon's offspring and his kingdom. So we want to get into Solomon's life and ways. The first thing we want to see is Solomon's wisdom. Solomon is the child of David and Bathsheba. Yes, when you think of like that Bathsheba, that was his mother. The first child only lived a few days after being born. Interestingly, the name Solomon, there's a little bit of debate about where his name comes from. One definition is that Solomon is a derivative of the Hebrew word for peace, which is shalom. Another meaning is that his name is derived from the Hebrew word shalem, which means replace. And so imagine going through life knowing that your parents called you basically redo. He's the replacement. Like that's what Solomon may have had to live with. So not too surprising, he would grow up with some different issues. Solomon, he reigned as the king for 40 years. His reign started around 960 BC. And there was a struggle to be the king for Solomon. His half-brother Adonijah, he was David's oldest living heir, and by rights, he was due the throne. However, God had something else in mind, and David himself had promised the throne to Solomon. The prophet Nathan had Bathsheba remind David, okay, you promised that Solomon would become the king. And so in the fight that ensued, Adonijah is executed, as well as some of David's advisors who sided with Adonijah. So the first thing that Solomon does then when he becomes king is he forms an alliance with the king of Egypt by marrying one of his daughters. And this is a sign of things to come, because it is through Solomon's lust for foreign women that his wandering from God occurs. Solomon wants to offer God some sacrifices when he first becomes king. And so that's where we pick up the story in 1 Kings 3, verses 4 to 15. The king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there because it was the most famous high place. He offered 1,000 burnt offerings on the altar. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream at night. God said, "Ask, what should I give you?" And Solomon replied, "You have shown great and faithful love to your servant, my father David, because he walked before you in faithfulness, righteousness, and integrity. You have continued this great and faithful love for him by giving him a son to sit on his throne as it is today. Lord my God, you have now made your servant king in my father David's place. Yet I am just a youth with no experience in leadership. Your servant is among your people you have chosen, a people too many to be numbered or counted. So give your servant a receptive heart to judge your people and to discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of yours?" Now it pleased the Lord that Solomon had requested this. So God said to him, "Because you have requested this and did not ask for long life or riches for yourself or the death of your enemies, but you asked discernment for yourself to administer justice, I will therefore do what you have asked. I will give you a wise and understanding heart, so that there has never been anyone like you before and never will be again. In addition, I will give you what you did not ask for, both riches and honor, so that no king will be your equal during your entire life. If you walk in my ways and keep my statutes and commands, just as your father did, I will give you a long life." Then Solomon woke up and realized it had been a dream. He went to Jerusalem, stood before the ark of the Lord's covenant, and offered burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. Then he held a feast for all his servants. So how would you respond if God came to you and said, "Ask, and whatever it is, I will give it to you"? I can think of how I would have responded, like just right off the cuff, like if God did that and just, "Hey, Greg, whatever you ask for, it's yours." And I hope that Solomon had some time to think about it, because, again, I know how I would respond at first, and then hopefully I'd be like, "Nah, let me think this through a little bit." Hopefully Solomon had that opportunity. For Solomon, though, the thing that he asked for pleased God, and because he asked for that one thing, God gave him so much more. What Solomon actually asked for was the ability to hear and process information correctly and justly. In our world, we call this wisdom. He didn't ask for knowledge. Solomon asked for the ability to handle the knowledge with God's justice in mind. So how many here understand, I'm not sure why this happened here. I'm just going to put them all up because they're out of order. How many here understand the difference between wisdom and knowledge? That there is a big difference. Lots of people are smart. I had some very intelligent professors in college and seminary. However, not as many of them had the kind of wisdom that Solomon talks about here. They would take all of this information and knowledge, and instead of processing it correctly and justly and faithfully to God, they came to conclusions that were against God. So you see, knowledge is supposed to bring us to God, not drive a wedge in our faithfulness and relationship with Him. I told my children all the time when they were little and they were struggling with, I don't want to study today, or there's too much homework or something like that. And I explained to them, you have to understand, all learning, knowledge is of God. So learning is worship. It's worshiping God. Whether you're studying the most annoying math problem or reading some book that just makes no sense whatsoever, you can do this in a way where it's honoring God and worshiping Him. I've shared this story before. Do you know what God used in my life to get me into youth ministry? It was nothing that I read in the Bible. I went to the bookstore. This was way back when they had bookstores that you could go in and sit down and read for free. And so I'm reading Marilyn Manson's autobiography. And I'm reading in this how he went to youth group once or twice, and the kids there just gave him a horrible time, and the youth pastor didn't show any kind, didn't welcome him at all. And I read that and I thought to myself, man, what if? All of the, and this was when Marilyn Manson was now he's a joke. But this was when, back in the 90s when he was Marilyn Manson, and people were ooh, he's scary. And I'm reading that and it's breaking my heart. And God used that to move me into youth ministry. So as we learn, it is worshiping God. And so we then get this example of Solomon's wisdom when there's this dispute among two women. One who lost her child, and the other one, and the lady who lost her child, steals the child from a lady who had it, and the child was fine, and she claimed that child was hers. And so this is Solomon's verdict, reading from 1 Kings 3, 25 to 28. This is a sign of his wisdom. The king said, "Cut the living boy in two, and give half to one and half to the other." Okay, so at first we're okay, yeah, that's not wise. That's kind of cruel, that's sadistic. The woman whose son was alive spoke to the king because she felt great compassion for her son. "My lord," she said, "give the other lady the living baby, but please don't have him killed." But the other one said, "He will not be mine or yours. Cut him in two." The king responded, "Give the living baby to the first woman and don't kill him. She is his mother." All Israel heard about the judgment the king had given, and they stood in awe of the king because they saw that God's wisdom was in him to carry out justice. Now notice, every time Solomon's wisdom is mentioned, it is coupled with God's justice. Think of the word justice. The definition of justice would be the way that things should be. If sin were removed from the equation, then justice, God's justice, is what we would have. Godly wisdom helps us to see how we should live, what we should say in a situation, how we should think. And Solomon at first was the epitome of godly wisdom. So much so that this is what is said of Solomon, 1 Kings 4, 29 to 34. God gave Solomon wisdom, very great insight, and understanding as vast as the sand on the seashore. Solomon's wisdom was greater than the wisdom of all the people of the East, greater than all the wisdom of Egypt. He was wiser than anyone, wiser than Ethan the Ezrahite. And there's He-Man again. Remember we were talking about He-Man before? And Calcol and Darda, sons of Mahal. His reputation extended to all the surrounding nations. Solomon spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005. He spoke about trees, from the cedar in Lebanon to the hyssop growing out of the wall. He also spoke about animals, birds, reptiles, and fish, emissaries of all people sent by every king on earth who had heard of his wisdom came to listen to Solomon's wisdom. As a Christian, we should seek to live as Solomon did here. Our knowledge should inform our actions and relationship with God and be lived out as godly wisdom as we live as we should live according to God's way and his truth. But there were other things that Solomon was known for that we should strive for as well. Another aspect of Solomon were his works. Solomon's father David wanted to build a temple to Yahweh, the one true God of Israel. David would come out of his residence and he would look down at the tabernacle. And it's this aged tent, and he would think to himself, that's no way to honor our God. And so he asked God for the opportunity to build a temple, but God said, no, David, you're not the one that's going to build a temple. You see, David was a warrior king, and he was responsible for too much bloodshed, and God did not want such a one building his temple. But God did say, one day, David, your son will build the temple. And so when Solomon came to power, he set about to build the first temple to God. And it was grand in its scale and in its beauty. Due to some of Solomon's changes that he made with redistricting his kingdom and opening trade with more and more countries, money started to pour into Jerusalem. Now also, it was obviously God fulfilling his promise that he would make Solomon rich. And we'll get into just how much money Solomon had. But this temple that Solomon built was so beautiful that at one point it was destroyed and it was rebuilt. And it did not compare, the rebuilt temple did not compare with the original, so much so that those who were old enough, when they saw the second temple rebuilt, they saw it and they started crying, not tears of joy. They were like, it used to be so much nicer. It was so much better. Think of like Maroon 5 covering a Beatles song. Like you would hear it and you're like, oh, you know what? It was so much nicer before. Like, why did somebody have to mess it up? And like they're trying to honor it, but it just doesn't compare. So Solomon is called upon by God to build this temple, but that was not all of his works. In 1 Kings 7, we read that he built a new palace complex for himself. And in that same chapter, we also read how he built something known as the house of the forest of Lebanon and the hall of the throne from where he would judge the people. He also had a number of other building projects. He had people build different utensils for worshiping God, all made of bronze or gold. Bronze basins that would hold 220 gallons, and he had 10 of those built that were 6 feet wide, probably similar to like our baptism trough here. Bronze water carts that were 6 feet long, 6 feet wide, and 4.5 feet high. These were some of the things that Solomon had built. And while some of the projects that Solomon worked on certainly only benefited himself, some of these other projects were either for the people or for God. So yes, some benefited him. But Solomon had these building projects because his kingdom was now in a state of relative peace. Solomon was the third king of Israel, and the first one had to deal with constant worry over this upstart shepherd kid, David, who, though he was not fighting for the throne, it was clear that God had given it to him. And then during David's reign, there was one internal struggle after another, putting down revolts all over the place by wannabe kings, including some from his own sons. And when the infighting wasn't happening, that was when it was time for David to expand the kingdom. And so that happened on a large scale. And so it was through David that the kingdom of Israel became the closest to what God had promised Abraham many thousands of years prior. So when Solomon came to power, it was a different time. It was a good time. It was the right time to build. You've heard me say a number of times that so often growth happens through struggle. And we have all experienced this, but none of us like it when it happens, right? It is better to grow, to build in peace. What do you do when your life is going well? Ask yourself this question. What do I do? What will I do if life is okay right now? Do I still look to God for growth, even when my life is going well, or if I am at peace? Or is that when I start to drift away from Him? Because things are good. I don't have that pressing need, so it's easier for me to forget about God. Realize that when God is blessing you with a time in which nothing that bad is happening to you, learn how to enjoy it. Recognize it for what it is. It is a blessing. It is a respite. It is an opportunity to grow in God's peace. There is a threat, and with this kind of growth, though, we will see what this threat is shortly. Solomon, he's known for his wisdom, for his works, and for his wealth. I mentioned this a little bit ago. When we think of Solomon's wealth, we have to move our brains into a whole other category. He was not just well off. He was not just a rich guy. This guy had crazy amounts of wealth flowing into his kingdom and his personal treasures. So let's jump ahead to 1 Kings 10, verses 14 to 29. We read here, the weight of gold that came to Solomon annually was 25 tons. Besides what came from merchants, traders, merchandise, and all the Arabian kings and governors of the land. So there was this 25 tons of gold per year that would come in, and then there was all the other stuff. 25 tons of gold. Okay, 1 metric ton of gold in today's numbers would be $65 million. If any of you have a metric ton of gold lying around in your house, let's talk. So 1 ton is worth 65 million. 25 tons of gold would be $1,625,000. More than $1.5 billion per year just from the gold. So this in essence, and this is tribute. These are taxes paid to the king. Verse 16, King Solomon made 200 large shields of hammered gold. Not very practical. You don't want a shield made out of gold because you could bend it with your hand, but it looks pretty. 15 pounds of gold went into each shield. He made 300 small shields of hammered gold. Nearly 4 pounds of gold went into each of those shields. The king put them in the house of the forest of Lebanon. The king also made a large ivory throne and overlaid it with fine gold. Imagine having so much money, you make a huge throne out of ivory, and then you're like, all right, let's cover it up with gold. Verse 19, the throne had 6 steps. There was a rounded top at the back of the throne, armrests on either side of the seat, and 2 lions standing beside the armrests. 12 lions were standing there on the 6 steps, 1 at each end. Nothing like it had ever been made in any other kingdom. All of King Solomon's drinking cups were gold. All of the utensils of the house of the forest of Lebanon were pure gold. There was no silver, since it was considered as nothing in Solomon's time. So much gold was coming into Israel that the palace would, if they saw silver, they were like, ew, it's not gold, it's silver. Verse 22. For the king had ships of Tarshish at sea with Hiram's fleet. And once every 3 years, the ships of Tarshish would arrive bearing gold, silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks. I don't know why those two, but King Solomon surpassed all the kings of the world in riches and in wisdom. The whole world wanted an audience with Solomon to hear the wisdom that God had put in his heart. Every man would bring his annual tribute, items of silver and gold, clothing, weapons, spices, horses, and mules. Solomon accumulated 1,400 chariots, 12,000 horsemen, and stationed them in the chariot cities and with the king in Jerusalem. The king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stones, and he made cedar as abundant as sycamore in the Judean foothills. Solomon's horses were imported from Egypt and Kue or Tarsus. The king's traders bought them from Kue at the going price. The chariot was imported from Egypt for 15 pounds of silver and a horse for 4 pounds. In the same way, they exported them to all the kings of the Hittites and to the kings of Aram through their agents. Solomon had a boatload of money. He wasn't going hungry. He didn't have to look under the seat cushions for his change. The guy had crazy amounts of money coming in. And what made all of this wealth possible? Where did it come from? It was a blessing from God. Back in 1 Kings 4:13, God said, "In addition, I will give you what you did not ask for, both riches and honor." You see, Solomon understood what value riches truly have in the scope of God's ways and purposes. How riches are viewed in comparison to a relationship with God. Solomon, if you did not know, he wrote many of the chapters of the book of Proverbs. And another book that he wrote was one called Ecclesiastes. Here is what Solomon had to say about riches and wealth. Ecclesiastes 5:10 and 11. The one who loves silver is never satisfied with silver, and whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with income. This too is futile. When good things increase, the ones who consume them multiply. What then is the profit to the owner except to gaze at them with his eyes? Solomon enjoyed his riches, but he also saw their real value, meaning they mean nothing. I know a lot of us here are like, you know what, Pastor, I'm willing to try that. I will be the guinea pig to see if riches really are that bad. And I get that. I understand that. But all of us here have seen what riches get people in life. Yes, it might make a lot of things easier, and we would like more money than less. But after our 60, 70, 80 years are lived up here, what do those riches mean for eternity? Eternity, not just 60 years, not just 80 years, 90 years, forever. Those riches mean absolutely nothing. And I pray that all of us would be able to arrive at the same conclusion regarding our money as Solomon did here. So in looking at Solomon, we see his wisdom, we see his works, his wealth, and lastly, we see his worship. Solomon, in many ways, was a worship leader of his people. He built the temple, and we read a few times in 1 Kings how he went and offered all sorts of different sacrifices to the Lord. Whether it was at the dedication of the temple where he had so much to sacrifice, or when he led the people of Israel in prayer at the temple, where he prayed this one wonderful prayer, 1 Kings 8:23. I don't think we have this on the screen, but it says, do we? Yep. He said, "Lord God of Israel, there is no God like you in heaven above or on earth below, who keeps the gracious covenant with your servants who walk before you with all their heart." Solomon saw his leadership not just as something that would benefit him. He saw it as an opportunity to be a spiritual leader to his people. And for those who are in different leadership positions at work, wherever you are you leading? Are you spiritually leading the people around you? Do you live your life in such a way that those around you are inspired to live for God, to serve God as you serve Him? Do people see Christ in you? Or are you one of these people that, I'm this way in church and then I'm that way at work? Back when I had a quote-unquote real job, Whether it was working in a plastic shop, at a clothes store, in a restaurant, managing a store, or being in sales, all those around me knew what was most important in my life. They knew that I was a Christian, and they knew it. They didn't know that I was a Christian because I would wear Christian t-shirts, or because I would throw Bibles at them, or because I would condemn them any chance I had. I simply lived out my faith in front of them. They saw my victories. They heard about it. They saw my failures. They heard about it, or they saw it themselves. And they heard me speak of Christ through it all. But the thing is, I'm not special for living that way. This is what God expects from all of us. No matter our situation, no matter our past, no matter how difficult it might be, no matter how much we just might not feel like doing it, we are called to be spiritual leaders and an example to those around us. And as Solomon showed us, the follower of God worships him for what he has done and for who he is. It is so important for us Christians, when we pray, when we live our lives out, when we read, spend time with others, when we work or play or rest, that we do so with a worshipful attitude. So it would be easy to think that Solomon was this great person for us to emulate, to be inspired by him. And certainly his writings in Proverbs and Ecclesiastes have inspired millions throughout the years. And in addition to his writings, the accounts of what I have read of him have certainly inspired many as well. But there is another part of Solomon's story, and though we're not going to get into it very much here today, Solomon had two glaring problems in his life that led, as I said, to the division of his kingdom, and worse, his heart turning away from God. You see, even with all of Solomon's wisdom, he could not refrain from wandering away from God. Listen to these words from 1 Kings 11, verses 1 to 3. King Solomon loved many foreign women, in addition to Pharaoh's daughter, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidionite, and Hittite women, from the nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, you must not intermarry with them, and they must not intermarry with you. Why? Because they will turn your heart away to follow their gods. To these women, Solomon was deeply attached in love. He had 700 wives who were princesses, and 300 who were concubines, and they turned his heart away. And if we were to continue reading, not only did Solomon sin by having all these wives and disobeying God regarding marrying foreign women, the reason God did not want Solomon to marry them was because of what happened next. Solomon then started to allow these women to build temples and shrines and statues and places of worship for all of these false gods right there in Israel. And this led not only to Solomon turning away from God, but it led to the people turning away from God. So Solomon led his people in worship of the one true God, and then he also led them astray from that same God. And this is what brings us at last to Matthew 12:42. Jesus was asked by some scribes to show them a sign that he is God, that he is Messiah. And this is what he said in Matthew 12:42. The queen of the south will rise up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, because she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon. And look, something greater than Solomon is here. There was this story about Solomon, I didn't even get into it today, where this queen from northern Africa goes up to visit Solomon and was very impressed by everything that she saw and heard. In fact, the record records that it took her breath away. And so if one was so impressed by Solomon's wisdom, by his wealth, by his works and his worship, let me just read a couple of the queen's reaction here. 1 Kings 10, 2-5. She came to Jerusalem with a very large entourage, with camels bearing spices, gold in great abundance, and precious stones. She came to Solomon and spoke to him about everything that was on her mind. So Solomon answered all her questions. Nothing was too difficult for the king to explain to her. That's his wisdom. When the queen of Sheba, verse 4, observed all of Solomon's wisdom, the palace he had built, that's his works, the food at his table, his servants' residence, his attendants' service and their attire, his cupbearers, that's his wealth, and the burnt offerings, his worship, all the burnt offerings he offered at the Lord's temple, it took her breath away. And yet, as great as Solomon was, Jesus is still greater. Solomon wrote all these proverbs, 3,000 as it says. Solomon was so wise, and yet Jesus, being God, is the creator and giver of all wisdom. It originates from him. As wise as Solomon was, he could never know all there is to know about all things, people, animals, events, ever. And remember that godly wisdom is tied to God's justice. And Jesus is the very embodiment of justice in this world. So yes, as great as Solomon's wisdom was, Jesus is greater. Solomon built all these magnificent buildings, things that would take a queen's breath away. And then we read that Jesus goes before us to prepare. He goes to build a room for us in his Father's house that we will enjoy for eternity. And here's the thing, as great as Solomon's temple was, as fantastic as his palace was, you cannot go and visit them today. They're gone. And we read that our treasures which are in heaven will never be destroyed. Moth will never be able to get to them. Rust will never weaken them. That which Christ builds remains forever. So yes, as great a builder as Solomon was, Jesus is greater. Solomon had riches galore, storehouses of treasures, literal tons and tons of gold every year. So much so that people were like, oh, get that silver away from me. Solomon had some wealth. But Jesus Christ being God, here's what God says about his wealth. Psalm 50, 9-12. I will not take a bull from your household or male goats from your pens. For every animal of the forest is mine, the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know every bird of the mountains, and the creatures of the field are mine. If I were hungry, I would not tell you. I love that line. God's like, what do I need to tell you if I was hungry? Like, what are you going to do about it? If I were hungry, I would not tell you. For the world and everything in it is mine. For the world and everything in it is mine. And by the way, not just the world, all that is everywhere came from God and is his. Psalm 24:1, the earth and everything in it, the world and its inhabitants belong to the Lord. Not just everything, but everyone is God's. And we were made by God and we are his, and I hope that you can take comfort, great comfort in that, because when we think about the way that God cares for us, there is nowhere that I would rather be than knowing that I am God's. Solomon had crazy wealth, but it was given to him by God, and all of it was really God's anyway. Jesus' wealth is greater than even Solomon's. And lastly, Solomon's worship. Yes, it was inspirational. He built the temple. He led his people in sacrificing to God. Through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, he wrote parts of the Bible. But Solomon built the temple, but Jesus is the temple. John 2, 19-22, Jesus answered, destroy this temple, and I will raise it up in 3 days. Therefore the Jews said, it took 46 years to build, and you will raise it up in 3 days? But he was speaking about the temple of his body. So when he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the statement Jesus had made. Solomon led in sacrifice, but then he had to do it again. And then he had to do it again and again. But Jesus is the sacrifice, and with him it is finished. Solomon wrote a part of the Word of God. Jesus is the Word of God. He is God's message, his truth to all of us. And so it is Jesus that we worship. It is Jesus' works in our lives that we seek. It is from Christ's riches that we are blessed. And it is Christ's wisdom that we look for in our lives as we live with God's justice in mind. Jesus Christ is greater than all. That is the point of this sermon. As great as Solomon was greater than any of us, all of us combined. And he still was nothing compared to Jesus Christ. Even the best of all humanity cannot compare to Jesus. So let us worship him now and thank him for who he is. I'm going to invite our worship team up. We're going to sing our closing song here. And as we're doing that, we're going to start passing out the elements for communion. So through the worship, through prayer, I would invite you to prepare your hearts for communion.